Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Richard Dunley and this is Jen Parker. This is the Maritime podcast where we discuss the key developments and activities that have been affecting maritime security and kind of broader maritime matters in the Indo-Pacific region over the past couple of weeks. We're recording this on the afternoon of Wednesday, the 19th of March. Always the disclaimer, if anything massive happens in the next day or so before we manage to get this out, that's why we're not covering it. So, Jen, how are things? What have you been up to?
I'm glad you said if anything massive happens, because it does feel like something massive happens in the world every single day.
Yep, feels like that right now.
What have I been up to? Look, a lot of media about AUKUS, which is interesting because nothing has actually fundamentally changed with respect to AUKUS at all in months, right? But it is back in the media again, the will we or won't we, and really the focus of most of the discussion is on phase 2 of AUKUS, which is the sale. Lots of people keep saying giving, by the way. So the US are certainly not giving Australia 3 Virginia-class submarines. They are certainly being purchased and at quite an expensive cost. So talking a lot about AUKUS, also thinking about the defence budget. For those that aren't Australian, the Australian government budget's going to drop next week, a little bit early because we should be going to an election very soon. And obviously defence is a key discussion point, thanks very much to the Chinese Naval Task Group that decided to circumnavigate Australia. So we do owe them a favour. Other things that are happening, big shout out to our new listeners and watchers who have come from a referral from Sal's What's Going On with Shipping. It was great to sit down with Sal and talk about What the Ship Australia, just the best title ever. We need to look at our title. So good to see you if you're watching it. And then finally, I'm off to, as much as I told everybody in my life that I'm not going to the Avalon Air Show, I have reneged, and I am heading to the Avalon Air Show in Australia for 24 hours next week to join Andrew, the Vice Chief of Defence Force Australia, Air Vice Marshal Robert Chipman, and Ewan Graham. Shout out to Ewan Graham if you watch it. To talk about future mega trends in defence and security. So that is me. Richard, you've actually been doing productive things, though. You've been writing, so let's talk about you.
I wouldn't necessarily say productive, but I occasionally actually manage to put fingers to keyboard and put some ideas down. And I had a piece that came out this morning in LOTE's The Interpreter, and it's something that I've been meaning to write for quite a while, and it tries to explore a little bit of, as a concept, again, for those who perhaps are not quite as familiar with the Australian context, a lot of people in Australia, and particularly in kind of defence and national security circles, talk about Australia operating in the archipelago, which is this nice sort of fuzzy term that we use to describe the area in which we think the ADF, the Australian Defence Force, is going to operate. And so in this, I try and unpack basically where is the archipelago. It is kind of what you would imagine it to be. The large swathe of sort of islands that are sometimes referred to as the kind of the land bridge that links Australia to continental Asia. So places like Malaysia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, all the way through down towards the Solomons. And so I then try and sort of unpick some of the challenges of using really fuzzy terms like the archipelago, and this sort of idea that we have that this is something of a blank strategic canvas in which we can do what we want, when in fact it's actually about 6 or 7 countries containing about 400 million people who have quite significant ideas about what they want to do with what's ultimately their country. So I think there's some interesting stuff there. It's not particularly novel. These ideas have been around for a while, but they don't get a lot of airtime, and I thought it'd be useful to kind of give them a prod once again. So if you're interested, take a look. It's on the LOTE website.
And we'll make sure we put a link in the show notes. And I think it's a really timely and important piece, actually, because I think I fall into the trap too of saying, littoral manoeuvre in the islands of the north, and the islands of the northwest are sovereign countries. So this is who aren't necessarily in agreement with some of our positions on things. So I think it's a really important reminder when we're doing some of our strategic thinking.
Absolutely, and it also feeds through into other elements like the DSU, so the Defence Strategic Update of a few years ago now, talks about the idea of shape, deter, and respond. Shape being kind of perhaps the softer element of defence, of being able to engage with regional partners, support them, get into a position where perhaps you can operate and they trust you enough to be able to operate in this kind of way. So it's not only about that kind of we have to change our defence settings, it's also about how we're viewing the region more broadly, which I think is interesting. It was something that was picked up again quite big way in the DSR, but the Defence Strategic Review, but hasn't really necessarily got a huge amount of traction, I would suggest, in political circles. Anyway, that's enough talking about that. We want to talk about what's been happening in the region.
Yeah. So there's very been happening. I mean, our last episode, we kind of just focused on what was happening with respect to Australia because that was a lot. But good to get media attention on maritime issues. But more broadly, look, we're back to the Red Sea. And Richard, you and I agree very much on the Red Sea. I'm joking. But look, of course, and we won't get into the details of this, but the ceasefire between Israel and Gaza has broken. There was discussion about that before it happened over the weekend. Now, how that affects the maritime domain is that, the Houthis in January ceased their attacks on ships. So they had been attacking shipping, we say in the Red Sea, but really it's the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Gulf of Aden, and a little bit in the Indian Ocean since November 2023. The Houthis did signal last week that if the ceasefire ceased, they would start attacking Israeli ships again. Now, let's just acknowledge that they weren't actually just attacking Israeli ships. They seem to be attacking any ship that was a target of opportunity. And there's not a lot of ships that have been now transiting through the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, since Houthis started attacking mid-November 23. That has garnered a very strong response from the US. So on the 15th of March, the US started attacking Houthi positions. So similar to what they had done on a number of occasions last year. There's some great footage online of Tomahawk missile firings, which is worth a look. And they have maintained this kind of persistent attacking of Houthi positions really for the last 5 days. I just looked on the CENTCOM Twitter website, and they had a post about 3 hours ago with more updates on this. So clearly there is a message there from the new US administration with respect to the Houthis and their threats of holding shipping at risk. So this is an interesting development. It's probably not a surprise, but it just reminds us again that how kind of at-risk key straits and strategic waterways can be in this kind of deteriorating global circumstances.
Yep, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. I'm, as you kind of hinted at before, I take perhaps a somewhat different view to others on this. I am not convinced that these attacks have had much effect so far. They've been going on for the attacks and the initial US UK attacks, I think, were at the very beginning of 2024, and they've been sort of sporadically since then, with limited seeming impact as far as we can tell. I'm not convinced that the next round of attacks are going to achieve very much apart from creating greater political support for the Houthis in Yemen, which is clearly already happening from the protests that we've already seen. So I think this is, in many ways, a very nice case study in the limits, in certain regards, of sea power in terms of the projection of power onto land. It can do quite a lot, but you can only go so far. And I think that there are real questions now about the degree to which there's been talk for as long as I can remember about the US pivot and the focus on the Indo-Pacific and everything else. Once again, we're seeing American forces being dragged back into the Middle East, and the expenditure of lots of ammunition, things like Tomahawks, etc., on these kind of targets. And this is at a time when there are efforts underway to build up stockpiles and everything else. So I think there are some pretty significant questions over the rationale and the thinking behind this. Although nobody thinks that the Houthis are doing the right thing here. I'm just not sure that firing a load more Tomahawks to follow the previous load of Tomahawks is going to achieve a huge amount. But hopefully I'll be proved wrong.
So I don't disagree with you. For those that are our new listeners, when I mentioned the disagreement, the disagreement between Richard and I was over the last 12 months about whether Australia should have sent a ship to the Red Sea, which I contended we should have, and Richard vehemently disagreed. But the discussion Australia has well moved past that. Look, I definitely agree with you, but I do wonder whether the latest rounds of attacks are actually about achieving an operational goal, or they're actually about strategic communications to not just those in the Middle East, about the new US administration's resolve when it comes to military engagement. And I say that because one of the critiques, and I have not researched this and it's not worth delving into it too much, but one of the critiques of the first Trump administration was that there was a view that Trump was very reluctant to use military force. And so perhaps this is also sending a message much wider in terms of US resolve. And perhaps they're willing to expend some of those valuable Tomahawks. I wouldn't be so willing, given the strategic circumstances, to achieve that. But who knows?
Yeah, I think that's true. The danger always comes from the fact that when you threaten to rain down death on the Houthis in the way that members of the US administration are, when they continue to be able to fire anti-ship missiles in 2 and 3 months' time, it rather undermines quite a lot of that strategic messaging. But yeah, I think there's definitely some significant showmanship going on here. Anyway, we can't talk about that forever. Moving on, what else has been happening in the region?
So look, one of the challenges in certainly Southeast Asia, which really is at the kind of the fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific, is the maritime territorial disputes. And of course, we all know about China's 9-dash line, and we talk about that all the time. But China's 9-dash line has not been the only historical maritime territorial dispute since the concept of exclusive economic zones came in the Third UN Convention of the Law of the Sea in the 80s and 90s. So in 2022, we did actually see Indonesia and Vietnam agree some delimitation of their exclusive economic zones. There has been discussion over the last couple of years about whether it would actually be respected, whether it would be ratified, etc., etc., etc. And so we've seen Prabowo signal. Now, it's not the first time he signaled this, but he has signaled to Vietnam that he intends to have it ratified in the next month. And intends to comply with it. So I guess it's a good example of how maritime territorial disputes in Southeast Asia can actually be resolved through discussion and engagement.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's part of a trend. For a long time, those who are focused on really focused on maritime sort of boundaries disputes and the politics behind UNCLOS have been talking about how one of the best ways in which you can try and potentially push back on some of the sort of massive overreach of Chinese claims is actually to get the ASEAN countries to agree on their own disputes, because there are lots of disputes between the different ASEAN countries in this region. So once they can sort out their own just sort of internal bilateral disputes and trilateral disputes, then actually you can have a much clearer and sort of more unified position to push back on the huge overreach that is in sort of embodied in the Chinese 9-dash line. Now, whether or not this is part of an attempt to do that, or this is something else that's driving the kind of the Indonesian decision to finally sort of go through with this and ratify this, it's not entirely clear, but I think it unquestionably it is something that can help in that broader approach of ASEAN coming together and agreeing on a sort of much more unified position to then try and push back on the Chinese claims. So I think in that regard, it's sort of relevant to the bigger picture and is potentially quite useful.
I agree, and I think it's worth acknowledging too. I was probably made it sound a lot easier than it had been. So they had been negotiating the delimitation of their EEZ, and we're talking about the EEZ in the vicinity of the Natuna Islands, which is significant because that is close to where China also contests their 9-dash line, overlaps Indonesia's exclusive economic zones. This took 12 years. So from 2010 to 2022, they were negotiating this. It wasn't simple. It wasn't easy. It wasn't like they just said, "Oh, look, we completely agree," right? So this has been going on for a long time. So I think it is quite significant. It is important. Does it change the dynamics in the region? Not fundamentally, but I think it does reinforce a message of how Prabowo sees his role and Indonesia's role in the region. I think under the previous president, Indonesia was a lot more internal looking. And certainly there's been a number of signals now since Prabowo's inauguration that they intend to be external looking, which is interesting for the regional dynamics.
Absolutely. And I guess looking from a slightly different kind of, softer sort of maritime security type perspective, these kind of things actually can help in terms of policing and enforcement. Being clear as to where it is that the EEZ lines run means that you can then be much more, there's far less grey area in which people who are not necessarily state actors, but people who are moving outside of the rules, whether this is IUU fishing, pollution, other things, can operate. So there's some wider positives as well, even beyond the kind of the narrative that we like to project onto everything, which is the sort of the grand strategic kind of narrative. Another thing that's sort of Southeast Asian focused, which I thought is interesting, and I'm not entirely sure quite how to read this one, is the Ream opening of the Ream Naval Base. So this is a naval base in Cambodia. It has garnered quite a lot of attention over the past 4 or 5 years, largely because much of the work was done by the Chinese. And this has been presented that the narrative that has been around this is that this is the development of a Chinese base in Cambodia. And for those who perhaps don't follow the politics quite as much, Cambodia is very much seen as probably China's closest ally or like-minded country within the region, certainly in sort of Southeast Asia and within ASEAN. And this is seen very much as part of China's push towards wider naval bases in the region and sort of the development of the Blue Water Navy, and particularly then linking into the push of the PLAN into sort of into the Indian Ocean, and the kind of more persistent presence in these kind of areas. So that's been the narrative very much around this, and has been until relatively recently. And indeed, as recently as September, the Cambodian Defense Ministry was saying that China is going to give Cambodia 2 small kind of corvette-style warships, which will be part of this. But the expectation very much amongst kind of Western analysts was that this base would be primarily used by the PLAN. Now, we've recently heard that the naval base is going to be opened by the Cambodian Prime Minister in a couple of weeks, and that this is sort of all of the facilities there, including new piers, dry docks, etc. And the first vessels to visit are going to be coming from Japan, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. So this is something that I think certainly comes as a little bit of a surprise to me in terms of both and we've seen hints, indications of this before, that the transfer of the base from potentially it being controlled or broadly controlled by the Chinese to the Cambodians, but then the much more open attitude towards it. And indeed, the Defence Ministry spokesman have said that warships from friendly countries are allowed to dock at the new pier as long as they comply with conditions. We don't know what the conditions are. But if you're seeing JMSDF vessels there, it's perhaps a rather different kind of image than the one which we'd expected. What's your read on this?
So I was actually quite surprised. I think there is a lot of evidence pushed out by a number of people, including think tanks like CSIS, with satellite imagery showing what has been not a permanent but a very lengthy presence of Chinese naval vessels at Ream Naval Base. Certainly much more beyond a port visit or maintenance period. So certainly they have some sort of footprint there, it would look like. This was interesting in terms of the approval of the Japanese naval ships to visit. Certainly, I think it's a bit of strategic communications in terms of this is not a Chinese naval base. It's a Cambodian naval base. Obviously, Cambodian Navy has limited capability. There was some reporting that other countries, I think potentially including Japan, but I have to check my facts on it, had actually requested to visit there a number of times, and it had been denied.
Yep.
Whilst there were these Chinese corvettes sitting alongside. So it's interesting. I'm still not convinced that there's not some sort of Chinese agreement regarding access to a footprint in Ream Naval Base. I think certainly it's hard otherwise to explain what has been not a permanent presence, but a lengthy presence of Chinese naval ships alongside Ream Naval Base. But I think it's interesting. It's good news that the Japanese naval ships are going to be visiting.
Yeah, and I think it will be something to follow up. And you never know, we might even see an Australian naval vessel visiting at some stage in the future. I might be pushing it. But...
So I actually went to Cambodia on an Australian naval ship on HMAS Darwin in, I don't know, but I'll be showing my age. Anyway, a very long time ago. I have photos of it. Obviously not to Ream Naval Base, but look, Australian ships do go to Cambodia, so potentially, who knows?
Moving on, and we have not got. We're going to try and keep on time this time. We invariably run over, so we're going to be hard on ourselves, and we're going to move on and we'll talk about capability. And you've been spending the week talking about AUKUS. So you might as well kick off by talking about Collins LOTE and explaining to our listeners what the wonders of the LOTE.
Right. Look, I will give a quick summary, but effectively, Australia operates 6 submarines. They're diesel submarines. They're called the Collins class. They're based on an enlarged Swedish design. We've had them since the 90s, effectively. The challenge with them is that with the delay in decision making about replacing them, so we had a 2009 white paper that said they needed to be replaced. It wasn't funded, decisions weren't made. There was then a decision around a French submarine project, which we will not delve into here whatsoever, except to say that project, then known as what was it, C-1000, the attack class, was cancelled by Australia and replaced with AUKUS. Now, the challenge with that is that, well, actually not the challenge with that. So actually the last reporting was that the first attack class was meant to come to Australia in 2034. So whether it was under the attack class or under the AUKUS program, the issue was that the Collins class submarines were going to need to be extended. So the first one to be extended was meant to be HMAS Farnham, which is what's in the news this week. So Farnham's about 27 years old-ish. If you served in Farnham and I got that wrong, I'm sorry, it's orders of magnitude, right? It's about 27 years old. I've never served in an Australian submarine. Anyway, so the plan was to undertake a life of type extension. This was meant to take about 2 years per boat, which actually involves cutting into the hull to replace a number of things, including the diesels, etc., etc. Last year, there was a classified report that somehow made it into the media from a former Deputy Secretary of the US Department of Defense that said, look, this really isn't on track. It doesn't look like Australia is going to be able to achieve this life of type. I'm dramatically paraphrasing what that report said. Please don't quote me necessarily on that. So it's been this debate about how viable is the life of type extension for all 6 of the Collins, which would have commenced in 2026 and gone over a 12-year period to 2038. Now, bearing in mind that Australia is meant to get its first Virginia class in 2032, and I would expect by 2038 have all 3. I don't think anybody has seriously thought that it would be viable for all 6 to go through that. We do know from Senate estimates last year in Australia that the boats, because of their age, because of how they've been operated, etc., have corrosion issues and maintenance issues. And there was a report late last year, it came out, I think it was in Senate estimates actually, that out of the 6, 1 was operational. Now, I think we made a bit much of that in Australia because out of 6 boats, you would never expect to have 6 operational, right? You'd probably expect to have 2 with the ability to surge to 3 and maybe 4, right? So we had 1 operational. What's come out in the last week through the Australian and some work by Ben Packham is that it looks like the design for HMAS Farnham to commence the first life of type extension in 2026 is not mature enough, and it will probably need to be scaled back. So Richard Marles, Australia's Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister, has come out and conceded that the government is considering scaling back the life extending upgrades, this life of type extension, of the Navy's Collins-class submarines. And to be honest, I think that's entirely prudent. And I think that we've discussed this before in terms of what is the purpose of the life of type extension right now. There is limited availability of the submarines. It is taking them out for 2 years. And I guess when I think about our Australian Collins-class submarines, which, have done a great job serving Australia, I think the priority right now is to keep them at sea, to keep Australian submariners at sea and keep that pipeline going as we ramp up the pipeline of Australian submariners in US Virginia-class boats and a smaller pipeline in UK Astute-class boats. So I think when you weigh up the cost of putting it through, all of them through this life of type extension, cutting the hull, etc., I think everybody acknowledges we probably weren't actually going to go down that path. So that's kind of my take on it. Now, of course, this then raises questions about capability gaps. What does it mean if Australia's Collins-class submarines don't last until the late 30s, which I don't think anyone actually believed they were going to do? I'm not so animated about this as many people are. Don't get me wrong. I don't think Australia should be in this position. I think that we should have sorted out the replacement a long time ago, and you can put Australia's ships and Anzac-class frigates in the same boat of that conversation. Look, I guess for me, in some ways, it's looking at, well, what are the operations that you want to do? What are the effects that you need to achieve for these columns, and how do you mitigate it with other things? From the training perspective, we are mitigating that by increasingly putting US submariners in Virginia-class, although not commanding, which is a different skill set, which is why we do need to keep our pipeline of Collins-class going. From a position of terms of having submarines in the region, that is mitigated somewhat by Submarine Rotation Force West under AUKUS Pillar 1, Phase 1, albeit not Australian submarines. And there are other capabilities that you can use to mitigate some of this capability gap. So I'm not trying to diminish it. It shouldn't have happened. But I think we need to be realistic about where we are as well. What's your take?
Yeah, I'm a little bit less sanguine, I think it's fair to say. I think there are some real risks. I think to picking up where you left there, I agree with you that there are ways in which you can mitigate some of the capability issues. I think that you're still, however, going to need to dramatically expand the number of submariners you've got, and we can't do that solely through putting them all on American boats. It's amazing, actually, how many submariners you need, particularly because most of them aren't actually on submarines at any one time. They're doing other things in the ADF. So that there's that kind of pipeline issue. But my kind of bigger concern with this is the indication, and it's something that I've been kind of flagging for a while, which is that the moment we're trying to do a huge amount in terms of, if you look at what ASC, for example, so ASC is the kind of government-owned shipbuilder down in Adelaide in South Australia, and they would be doing this sort of very significant life of type extension. So they're going to be running this. They're also working up and running, preparing to build the new SSN AUKUS. They're also working on Hunter-class frigates. They are competing for workforce with the new shipyards in Henderson and elsewhere. We are trying to do a huge amount at the moment, and I think it's unsurprising that some of these things are falling over. And I worry that this is part of a sort of a wider challenge in that kind of way, that we don't necessarily have sufficient people, skills, and everything else to manage to do all of the many things that we're trying to do at the moment. And I think this could be an indicator of that. I just think we do need Collins LOTE, even if you think, okay, well, we're going to have 3 Virginias, well, 2, potentially 3 Virginias by the mid to late 2030s. As you yourself have admitted, 2 submarines does not a capability make, right? So we are at this stage where we're going to have to be operating very old diesel-electric submarines. Nobody thinks that's a good thing, but that's just kind of the brutal reality of where we are. So we're going to have to do at least get some of this LOTE right. I agree with you, probably not all 6 boats, but we'll see. So yeah, I think there's a lot of worry from my perspective.
Look, I don't mean to diminish it. I think it is significant. I guess my point is more this. I mean, I'm not surprised. Like, I'm pretty sure we discussed this on the podcast last year, and I said that there's no way, or I said it to someone in the media, or I don't know, something. There's no way that they're all going through a life of type extension. I think that the government, or sorry, Richard Marles' comments today that, or yesterday, sorry, in the Australian, that it might be de-scoped. Look, I think the question is, what is it that they're looking at doing, and how long does it extend them, right? So, yes, there is some work that obviously needs to be done, right? Avoiding cutting into the pressure hull on a submarine would be a really good thing to do, to be honest. Not a submariner, not a naval architect, but that sounds like a big pain in the bum. So, look, I think we need to wait and see, what does this de-scope look like? What does it mean in terms of how long we will be able to safely operate them? What does it mean in terms of the restrictions that might be placed on them in terms of where they can operate and how they can operate? I think we need to see that play out. I do agree that it is significant. I'm just not surprised. Like, I just think this was really obvious. And this is what happens when governments of either flavour don't invest in naval capability, don't make decisions. And really, you can trace all of this kind of back to honestly, kind of the early 2000s. And this is what happens. And we just need to make sure that when we're thinking about our urgent strategic situations now and what we can do quickly, we also have a mind to our long-term planning, so we don't put ourselves in this position in another 20 years, would be my comment. And also, you're right on the growth of submariners. It is, I think the figures were 800 submariners currently serving roughly in the Royal Australian Navy, needs to grow to 3,000. So that is going to be a significant challenge. So not trying to diminish that.
Also on shipbuilding, another story that's come out recently is that Hanwha, the big South Korean shipping giant, or sort of industrial giant, who have a very large shipbuilding enterprise, one of the biggest shipbuilders in the world, both commercial and naval tonnage, have come out and said that they have acquired a 9.9% shareholding in Austal, who are the big the largest Australian shipbuilder. They operate primarily in Western Australia, but also in the United States as well. Austal do a lot of tends to do a lot of smaller craft. Their origins was in kind of aluminium craft and fast ferries, but they're growing quite extensively and moving quite heavily into naval shipbuilding. So this Austal is a really important part of the Australian kind of defence industrial base, particularly naval industrial base, absolutely critical element of that. Now, they have had all sorts of kind of financial challenges for some time, and Hanwha in particular has been very interested in acquiring them. They had a buyout offer for Hanwha made a buyout offer for Austal last year, which was eventually rejected, at least in part because Austal didn't believe that the Australian government would effectively allow it. So it's now, and it was quite a bitter and sort of there was some quite significant recriminations between the two companies at the time. So it's really interesting now that Hanwha has come back and is obviously now making another move. They've also applied to the Australian Foreign Investment Review Board to increase that shareholding from just under 10% to just under 20%. And so obviously we'll have to see how that one plays out. There's a lot going on here that I must say I'm trying to work out what all of this means. What what Hanwha's trying to do, given the challenges and the kind of the failure last time around. But also, a lot of the discussion previously was focused around the C3000, the new Australian project to acquire general purpose frigates, and the South Korean designs. There was a South Korean design as one of the initial shortlist of 4, and so Hanwha were very much considered to be in the running. Indeed, a lot of people considered them to be one of the kind of the front runners potentially to build these new frigates for Australia. And so they were seen as this kind of synergy that if Hanwha, very successful shipbuilder, bought Austal, they got the contract for these frigates, you could see quite a lot of connections coming through. To a lot of people's surprise, the South Korean option was cut at the down select to 2 designs. Now, at the moment, Australia is currently looking at either a Japanese design or a German design. So quite how that then fits in potentially to these designs being built by Austal in Western Australia, if Austal is owned or with a large shareholding from a South Korean firm who is actually a competitor of the companies that own these designs. So it potentially Mitsubishi or otherwise. So there's a lot of kind of questions here that I really I've been trying to think about it since the story broke, and I still can't really come to any clear picture as to quite what's going on. But it certainly there's a lot to unpick. What were your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, certainly. I agree. There's a lot to unpick. I was surprised by it. I thought this was kind of done and dusted last year a little bit. Look, it does still obviously need to get the Foreign Investment Review Board, as you mentioned. I would have assumed, but I'm not an expert on this, that it would need some degree of US approval as well because of Austal's significant work in the United States building ships there. So I think there's a lot of water to go under the bridge before this actually happens. I think it's interesting. I think there's a tick in terms of confidence in Australian shipbuilding, which I always like. We should have more confidence in Australian shipbuilding. But look, what the aim is and where it's going, to be honest, I am really not sure.
Yeah, I wonder. Obviously, you mentioned the American angle, and I kind of wonder whether actually that's the real angle here. Only last week there was a lot of discussion between South Korean and American officials and industry talking about potential synergies in terms of shipbuilding. Austal already have quite a significant foot in the door in terms of the American market. And I wonder whether actually, in many ways, Austal for Hanwha is more attractive looking at American option than Australian. But I don't know. That's pure speculation. But there's certainly a lot going on here, even beyond the Australian context.
Yeah, definitely. Other exciting thing, well, not exciting things, but I think it's exciting. We have actually had news that in September 24, Australia did its first sea mining firing. First in a significantly long time, which I thought was interesting. So, in the force structure plan in 2020 that Australia released, we said we were going to move back into acquiring sea mines, which was a good decision because when you think about defending Australia from a maritime perspective, mining is fairly critical and did prove to be during World War II. So is counter mining and mine clearance, but we won't delve into what is happening with that at the moment, which I think is one of our biggest challenges. Anyway, so it comes out that the Navy has done the vessel-class firing for its new sea mines, which the Navy bought from RWM Italia. We knew that the first batch of these actually arrived in February 24, and laying of them was incorporated into an exercise last year. I think it might have been Exercise Dugong or something like that. So, look, I think there's no details in the reporting about how, why, what happened, etc., but I think this is just a good news story. I think that Australia is moving along with its mining capability. Look, this was announced in 2020. I would like to think we were a lot further along than this. Perhaps we are. But either way, it is a good direction for Australia to be going in. So I think that's a positive news story. What's your take on mining?
I mean, I wrote a book on mines. I love mines, right? One of a select group of about 3 people around the world.
You can just see by my face I haven't read that book, but I will put it. I will put it on the list of books to read, and I'll get your autograph.
So yeah, I think it's a good news story. I find the general kind of Western Navy ignorance / intentional disregard of mine warfare one of the most bizarre aspects of kind of modern sea power navies, etc. So I think it's a good news story. I would love to see exploration of further mining and mine warfare options. I think there are still a lot of questions about how we intend to deploy these, from what assets we intend to deploy these. They are ground mines, so they're relatively limited in terms of their scope in which they can be deployed. But it's an important capability, and as you say, one that is particularly important to somewhere like Australia. You've only got to look to the archipelago, which we were talking about earlier, to the north to see why mine warfare might be something that we would want to be interested in. So yeah, good news story. And to be honest with you, it's something, even where there is stuff going on, actually trying to find out what is going on and get any kind of information is really, really hard. Both in terms of the fact that it's not exciting and sexy, so nobody ever you don't get any exclusive leaked stories about mines. But also, navies tend not to talk huge amounts about it. So I think this came out through a Freedom of Information request. So it doesn't surprise me that we're only finding out now that this happened in September 2024. So yeah, good news story.
So, Richard, I guess one final capability thing to talk about, which is interesting that it's actually in the news, is the upgrade to the Naval Communications Facility. I think it's about 7 kilometres or so from 6 kilometres, from Exmouth in Western Australia. So, for those that aren't Australian, that's northwest Australia. You don't hear a lot of communication about the Harold E. Holt Communications Station. Tell us about it, Richard. What's happening?
So you don't hear very much, and the Harold Holt Naval Communication Station is one of my favourite things on many levels. Not least because they named it after Harold Holt, despite the fact that there were numerous stories about the fact that he was abducted by a submarine.
We might have to explain that after this, by the way, who Harold E. Holt was. But yes.
This is it's a naval communication station. It was originally run by the Americans, despite being based in Australia. It has been taken over since the early 1990s by the Australian Department of Defence, but is still kind of a joint facility. It is used for basically an ultra-low frequency transmitter and communications device. It is used for communicating with submerged submarines. It is part of a wider US global network that allows them to communicate with their submarines. It was developed in the 1960s to facilitate primarily communication with ballistic missile submarines as part of the wider development of a strategic deterrent. And so this is why its location, partly being a long way from anywhere, but also in that part of the world, is so important for the United States. It is a weird-looking kind of facility. It's basically lots of masts with some cables attached. Don't ask me how it works. I have absolutely no idea. But by all accounts, it's basically early to mid Cold War technology, and so we recently heard that actually there's a significant upgrade going on to it, and that this is something that's underway and is going to see a sort of revamp and redevelopment of quite a lot of the technology involved. It's primarily interesting, as you suggest, from the fact that despite it being a communication station, it is something about which we hear very little communication. Indeed, it's generally kind of ignored. I guess it fits to a degree in the kind of the narrative around places like Pine Gap, which is again a joint Australian-American facility, but it doesn't get anything like the kind of attention that Pine Gap gets.
Well, it doesn't now, but it did. So actually, looking back through the history, it was actually quite controversial because you mentioned it was a US base. It was handed over to the Australian Navy in the 90s. And actually now it's actually run by contractors. It's run by Raytheon, I think. It's actually not run by the military. It's run by a contract. But it was controversial, right? So in the 70s, when it was still being operated effectively as a US base, I can't remember how many it was, but a significant number of protesters. And when you think about how remote Exmouth is, I'm trying to see if I can find how many protesters. No, can't find how many, but significant hundreds of protesters actually went out there, I think in 1974, to protest about US bases on Australian soil, right? And it says 55 people were arrested during the protest. It was really dramatic at the time. And I think it's an important point, not just because we don't often talk about the Northwest Cape Communications Facility, but also because of the sensitivities in Australia about US basing. And so somebody said this to me recently, like, no, Australia does have US bases, Pine Gap and Harrowley Holland. And actually, they're not US bases. They were. They are not now US bases. And it's very sensitive in Australia to think about the concept of foreign bases. And I don't think that that's something that the Australian public would accept. And that's why we talk about Submarine Rotation Force West. That's why we talk about marine rotations, which, again, the amount of US capability and personnel in Australia has rapidly increased since Julia Gillard signed off on who was our former Prime Minister, only ever female Prime Minister, signed off on the force posture initiatives in 2012. Like, they have rapidly increased, but we do not have US basing in Australia, and it is something that there would not be social license for. So I think that's interesting. We should also just quickly say who Harold Holt was, by the way, for our listeners. So Harold Holt was actually the Prime Minister of Australia. He became the Prime Minister in about 1966. On the 17th of December 1967, he went swimming in Portsea, Victoria, and disappeared. So body was never found. So, pretty significant thing when your Prime Minister just disappears. And Richard, as you mentioned, there were lots of rumours and theories that he was picked up or kidnapped or whatever by a Russian submarine, none of which seem absolutely logical in any way, but it is named after the former Australian Prime Minister who went missing.
It is wonderful Australian humour that the two things that I know of named after Harold Holt, one is a submarine communications facility and the other is a swimming pool, despite the fact that he disappeared whilst swimming with rumours of being taken by a submarine. So I think that's a wonderful introduction to those new to the podcast on Australian humour.
It is. Well, we better wrap it up. So thanks, Richard. It's been great. I recommend for people to check out Richard's article in Lowe's Interpreter. We'll put a link in the show notes talking about the archipelago. And as always, it sounds corny, but maritime matters.
Absolutely. Good to chat. Speak soon.